5,000 years ago, human beings began for the first time to build their own world. They moved into cities, and people would live all of their lives amidst structures, both social and physical, that were built by human beings. Today, we're taking the first step in 5,000 years that's really analogous. We are moving our society into computer-mediated telecommunication channels. So the decisions we make today are going to affect how society works for a very long time into the future.
Privacy has become a question of power. Our power, their power, whoever they are. It's not just a set of clinical legal conditions that set the parameters for the use of data. That's not what it's about. It's about us understanding as individuals that this is an ancient right and a precious, fragile right that has to be preserved. And if it has to be preserved through aggressive campaigning and through even civil disobedience, then that's the way it should be, because that's the history of the protection of our rights. I've often thought, who's responsible for the destruction of privacy in Britain? And the reality is it's everybody. It's not just the traditional enemies, it's not just the big bad companies or big brother government. It's people that allow those entities to exist and to thrive. People have an interest in invading privacy as well as governments and companies do. People are fascinated about what happens in the private lives of other people. Neighbours are spying on neighbours, family upon family. We're finding increasingly that this is a game, surveillance is a game that everybody can play. And do you know what? Everybody is playing it. And that's one of the reasons why there isn't anger at the government. Because people say, well, you know, I'm eavesdropping on my employees. I'm spying on my wife. I'm tracking the mobile phone of my children. So, you know, what the government's doing isn't that bad, really. And that is the core of our problem.
Privacy means human dignity. It means my and your right to personality and to character. It means my right to be intimate, to be open with myself and to not be vulnerable necessarily to you. It's essential to how I think about myself. Even Sigmund Freud observed such was privacy that even parts of our own selves are kept private, i.e. the subliminal. The human condition lives in multi-conscious states. Some aspects of that in my relationship to you I make known. Other aspects of myself, it is my right to withhold.
Privacy is not having to give people information without you having a good reason from them why they want that information. It's being able to restrict the information you give out to what is necessary. It's peace and quiet. It's not being watched. Can I film you in your house? Can I come into your house and film you? What have you got to hide? Can I look at your bank account? Can you tell me what your salary is? How much are you paid? When did you last take drugs? What are your innermost thoughts? Everyone has something to hide. It's not hiding, it's private. Okay, take your clothes off. Excuse me, but I really do not see why a customs officer, a policeman, or a politician, or special branch officer is of necessity to be trusted with my private information. Why is that? When did they become Superman? When did they become incorruptible?
There's something very unhealthy about living in a world where you have to reveal everything. And if you don't reveal everything, you must have something to hide. Well, yeah, I do have something to hide. You know, it's my privacy. I like to keep that private.
Privacy was a natural phenomenon a couple of hundred years ago. Before you had electronics, all you had to do was walk a short distance away from other people, and you could have a private conversation. Only in the most extreme environments, like prisons or something, could people be denied the power to have private conversations. Today, nobody who is of interest to other people, no matter how powerful, can have a private conversation just as an individual action. There is a transition from something that indeed seems like a natural human right, something that only can be achieved by a trust among a significant group of people.
Anyone who's willing to trade a little bit of liberty for a little bit of security will probably get neither. And I think privacy kind of falls into that box. The modern world, modern information technologies provide an incredible ability to view what's going on in the society, in the city, and to capture that, maybe forever. That runs head on into the expectation of citizens in a democracy that the government's not going to be watching them every minute of the day. When you add on to that the tensions caused by terrorism in the modern world and the desire of the citizens to have physical security from someone harming them, and you have a very, very complex mixture of what the technology allows, what the political structure and the citizenry will allow, what the political structure and the citizenry demand in the way of security, and what they may be willing to give up in the form of privacy in order to obtain a little bit, perhaps, better security.
What affects the entire society? I think security, I'm interested in security in part because it's a very fundamental human mechanism. You recognize your family, your friends, your colleagues. This is the most fundamental security action that anyone takes in life. If you couldn't recognize the people you trusted, the people whose interests are aligned with yours, you wouldn't be able to get any assurance of this kind. That's why I'm telling you that recognition is the most fundamental security phenomenon and is a fundamental phenomenon in human culture.
Security is the feeling that I will, in fact, have the same basic kind of day tomorrow as I had today, meaning that I know that the chances of my being blown up in a restaurant or a bus are slim. That's security. The chances of my being attacked or kidnapped or whatever are slim. So it means that there's a certain predictability to life, that I don't have to be worried about uncertainty, and I don't have to worry that tomorrow is going to be a catastrophe for me, even though today was fine. It's much more of an invasion of my privacy if somebody blows me to smithereens on a bus than it is if somebody asks me for my ID. security and privacy, people will say they don't go together. Because if I'm anonymous, then so is the terrorist. But at the same time, it's actually looking at the wrong place, because for somebody to know who I am is not a threat to me. In other words, if something is really going wrong in a society where you find that people are living in fear for what's going to happen the next day, then you know that the security in that society has been undermined. And you can predict that in a democracy, that undermining of security is going to change things. The society that I'm from, people are used to being targeted by terrorists. And so for that reason, they're willing to give up a certain amount of personal space in order not to be targeted. So we have what in America, for example, would be considered invasive searches of people's handbags if they go into malls, things like that. They always check who you are. Sometimes they may ask you to show an ID if you go into a mall to see who you really are. And people are willing to put up with that. But security is only as valuable to a citizen as he believes his security can be breached. For example, if he believes that he's not in danger, that he won't put up with these things. If he thinks that he is in danger, he's willing to put up with a good deal more of an invasion of his privacy.
I guess there are a variety of ways of looking at security. At a national security level, I think it means the ability of the nation state to accomplish its strategic objectives and to keep its people safe, its economy functioning, its way of life secure, etc.
This is ground zero. The trains were smashed, and the people were smashed on the ground because the buildings came down. This is brand new. But I look at this, I tell them this. They look through the cracks and don't realize what they're looking at. This is new construction that got smashed when the buildings came down. They're building back up with 5 new buildings they plan to put back. So this one is under construction. The other one you were standing in front of was already done. And I saw the police officer come over and say, hey, security. The cameras are everywhere, even on the bridges. I tell people the security has changed. 9/11, America has woke up. So you see the security, you see the armed guards, and I tell the young ones, 9/11 is, but now they make it, people will panic, and they only think, oh my God, they're not paying attention. There's some Americans who come here, oh, it's business as usual. No, everything has changed. Everything has changed, everywhere. I tell the young ones, I don't care what you see. I got to show you cameras on the bridge, everywhere. 9/11 has done this. Oh, no, we don't talk about it. Why? You police officer, you should talk about this. No, we told not to discuss it. Not to discuss it? What ground zero really means? Don't talk about it? Why? The fear factor has a lot of things, but this is, for years, America never paid attention to the rest of the world. It's like, only America. No, it's the world. And this is what they don't talk about. They'll say ground zero before make people realize the fear that they're putting in you is like having blinders on. I don't see it, so it can't be true. What? I don't see it, no. I tell some people, if you don't realize how it's changed the world, then you fell asleep already. 9/11 has changed America big time. Big time. Yeah, some people don't know this. Some people walk around, don't even know what they're looking at.
Actions have consequences. Incidentally, all of this surveillance is motivated, allegedly, by a need to protect the society from terror. And yes, society wants to be protected from terror, but it's worth bearing in mind that that's a pretty low priority of governments. For example, take the invasion of Iraq. I mean, it was perfectly well known by intelligence agencies, individual analysts, Congress, that the invasion of Iraq would probably increase the threat of terror. They understood that. But they invaded anyway. There were higher goals than protecting the population from terror. And in fact, it did increase terror. According to government figures, terror increased by about a factor of 7. It's a big increase after the Iraq invasion. And there are many other examples.
The terrorists win when they frighten governments into reducing our liberties. The way to respond to terrorism is to keep being free, is not to give up our liberties, is genuinely to keep our way of life. I remember when Tony Blair was the Prime Minister of the UK, on the same day that the bombing of the London Underground happened, on the 7th of July, a couple of years ago, he said, "The terrorists will never change our ways." Then immediately they introduced new laws, new restrictions on liberties, more surveillance, and so on. The victory belonged to the terrorists.
For a long time, since the end of the Cold War, in fact, there's been a kind of search by companies involved in security products, especially those involved in supplying to the armies, the military during the Cold War, for a new way of selling these kinds of things, the products they make, and by governments to justify the vast amounts of money and investment they had in security services. And in fact, in some ways, 9/11 just provides a justification for that kind of investment and that kind of time. We've been living in a society that's been obsessed by security for quite some time. I mean, probably much of the 20th century, if not much beyond that. And I think it's important to remember that goes right back into the origins of civilized society. The whole origins of the city, for example, are geared around security, around defense, around control. By the ruler of their territory, by control of people in a place, by vigilance about outside and internal threats. The thing is now, what has changed in recent years is the kind of symbolism associated with security. Security now has almost stopped meaning anything real. It starts to be something that is provided in a symbolic way, as a form of PR or spin, to make people feel better about themselves.
Surveillance is being subject to scrutiny. And that can be physical scrutiny, or financial scrutiny, or scrutiny of anything about you. In its simplest form, surveillance is having a camera pointed at you, which records everything that you do.
Do you know that from the time you get up in the morning to the time you go to bed at night, if you make a mobile phone call, if you use your credit card, if you use your bus pass, if you go into the public domain anywhere, if you visit your doctor, if you go into a post office, that anything that you do will leave a trace, and that if anybody wanted to make a complete story about you, they can. We now have public spaces, both in the electronic sense of the public space and in the actual physical public space, which are constantly and universally monitored. So you can take any individual, and if you became interested in that individual, and that individual was a normal person who had a card for the bus and who had a mobile telephone and a credit card and watched the television and used the computer, just an ordinary person in society, you can make a completely accurate and comprehensive and detailed record of what that person has been doing during the day.
When you go into a bank, your fitness to be granted a loan is assessed through these kinds of transactions, through your value to the company. Those people who are at most considered to be a risk to these companies will be the first ones who are denied services, denied mortgages, denied insurance, denied banking services.
There is a widespread deployment of millions of video cameras, putting facial recognition software behind those cameras so that you can recognize people as they walk on the streets and see where everyone is going all the time, to keep track of people and everywhere they go.
Many of us have GPS systems in our cars. These are also a form of surveillance connected to an American military system, as it happens, but which is very useful for everyday individuals.
The fact that now the government has admitted that every day it captures 50 million number plates and stores those number plates centrally so that in real time they can track vehicles all over the country. Everybody's vehicles, not suspects. That is surveillance at its greatest potency. When you pay with your Visa card, you're leaving a footprint of where you go. It's easy, once you've left enough traces around all of these different systems, to bring those pieces of evidence to create a picture of who you are, what your associations and your interests are. So we move then from digital footprints, which you create, to the digital person, the digital persona.
Many of our actions at work are now under surveillance in various ways. There is a real intense scrutiny of people's actions. How many keystrokes someone performs on the computer, how many sales somebody makes, how long they spend on the phone talking to each customer. These kinds of very intense forms of hour by hour, minute by minute, second by second control in the workplace are something which people are increasingly putting up with a normal working day.
They're going to look at your email, they'll read your email, they'll listen to your phone calls, they'll see what time you go home. And they won't stop there. They'll even see what your habits are outside, because they'll look at your Facebook page. They'll read your tweets. They'll look at your videos on YouTube. You're helping them by giving them all this information, by sharing it with them, by putting your name out there and attaching it to all kinds of things that maybe you don't want to be attached to your name. But they will have complete control over your life, and they'll be able to dictate. They'll be able to say, we know that you smoke. If you continue smoking, we're not going to offer you health insurance. That comes with our company, which you need in order to survive. And that's the trap a lot of people find themselves in. They have to continue working in order to maintain their lifestyle. And they'll change whatever the company tells them to change in order to continue to do that. And that's power. That's real power.
When you're using an Oyster card, you're leaving a footprint of where you go. And of course, footprints take you back to the source, lead you to the future. You just watch those footprints. They tell you a lot about the individual.
If you go into a shop, if you buy anything, you use a credit card or a debit card, those transactions are recorded. Those bits of information go into a database of your consumer habits, which are put together to make a picture of you that companies use to try and sell you new products or to try and market different kinds of services to you. A couple of years ago at a conference, I was talking to a senior executive from a loyalty card company who assured me that from the purchase patterns of individuals, they could identify the sexuality of people, and that this was regularly used in sorting information out. So, for example, if you're thinking that you're actually concealing your sexuality for whatever reason, it may well be that even commercial companies who analyze your purchase patterns think they have ways, using software, using algorithms, of identifying patterns they conceive of as being representative of certain sexualities.
There are some circumstances when you might, for example, not like for everybody to know that when you purchase meat, you purchase halal meat or kosher meat. In most countries, that would be insignificant, not sensitive. But there are countries, in times not so long ago, and perhaps in times not so far in the future, when that kind of information might be very sensitive. Increasingly, insurance companies are interested in what kind of diet people have, how much alcohol they consume, in order to calculate what their life expectancy and health expectancy is.
Google has the most immense amount of information about what you do on the internet, and as our lives are lived more and more online, Google becomes incredibly powerful. These online providers have been incredibly irresponsible about who they share this data with. Yahoo and Google have both been guilty of sharing the information and surfing habits of activists, of journalists in China with the Chinese authorities. It starts to bring to mind, though, where is responsibility held for these companies? If we're living in a global surveillance society, a global information society, how do you control the global flow of information about you? At the moment, under data protection laws, this is just seen as information about you. So you have some rights over it. You have some ability to intervene to make sure it's accurate and to make sure it isn't shared unnecessarily. But I think things need to go further than that. We do have to start thinking about this information as actually being, in some ways, similar to the real physical body, to be part of a thing that makes up you or me as a person. It is, in some ways, us. This data body, this data shadow, this kind of alternative you that exists inside a database is increasingly more important to your life chances and to what happens to you throughout your existence than your real physical body. In some ways, things that can be done to your data subject, your data body, are more important than what happens to you in real life. This means a re-evaluation. It means thinking about these data subjects in terms of citizenship, in terms of rights, in terms of a relationship to the state that isn't just about them holding information on you, or a relationship indeed to companies that isn't about them just holding information on you. So in some ways, what I'm arguing is we need to free our data bodies, to give a kind of digital habeas corpus, to have rights for data bodies along with our own physical bodies.
We are creating a surveillance society that is going to be difficult for us to escape from. We have to wake up and recognize the problem and push back. We have to place limits on what companies can do with the data. We have to put policy limits on what governments can do. We especially have to limit the purposes that governments can use this data for. They say that they want to use it to catch Al-Qaeda. Well, that sounds like something that a lot of people would agree with, but when they also use it for all kinds of other purposes, it undermines our freedoms.
In the United States, high schools give over information about every student unless a parent or the student specifically calls the school and says, "Do not give information over about my son or daughter." But right now, it's sort of like reading, writing, and arithmetic. It's now reading, writing, and recruiting. And the names of millions of young people who are 17 and 16 and 18 years old is being handed over to the Pentagon through their schools. Recruiters get that information, military recruiters, and they call kids on their cell phones. They learn about them. They get data on them. And they bypass their parents, and they are trying to get them to join the military. And there's a whole counter-recruiting movement in the United States of people who are saying, no, you can't have our children's information. And we see it over and over again in many different ways. JetBlue Airlines, a civilian airline company, giving over millions of names after the September 11th attacks to the Pentagon of their passengers. When people get put on a terrorism watch list, they don't know how to get off of it.
There is the creation of a global surveillance society and efforts by the USA, largely, to create, if you like, a global surveillance system that will encompass the whole world for military, for political, for economic reasons. So you can see networks of orbital satellite cameras in place, which can do all sorts of things. They can provide GPS signals for the armed forces and for civilians who've got mobile phones. They can also take very detailed pictures of towns and cities, right down to the level of individual people, even lower than that. These cameras exist on satellites all around the world. We've seen, for example, in the last few years, the introduction of UAVs, that is, unmanned aerial vehicles, not just as they used to be used on the battlefield, but these kinds of systems are now being used on the streets of cities in ordinary Western democracies. But at the same time, we've got to remember that the Federal Bureau of Investigation in America is constructing what's called a server in the sky. This is designed to link up national databases all over the world, to draw that information into the FBI's computer and to use that to identify international criminals and terrorists and so on. However, then you have societies like Britain, very intensely surveilled and watched, which use surveillance in ways that are unprecedented compared to other parts of the world, with more cameras in public places, with more laws that allow for the intrusion into privacy and the removal of rights than have existed before.
Well, the UK is a surveillance society like nobody has ever seen. I mean, I went to London and I went to Singapore in the same year, and I was blown away by how much more of a surveillance state London is. I expected Singapore to be very Orwellian and Big Brother-ish, but you cannot beat London for Orwellian. You have the voices through the loudspeakers constantly telling you what to do. You have the constant fear in everybody that something bad's going to happen at any moment, that you have to always be watching. And I think we can look to London as a warning to what could happen anywhere. You certainly don't see a decrease in crime. You certainly don't see a decrease in potential terrorist activity. and you sure don't see a decrease in fear. So I don't think the surveillance works. I don't think that's the answer. I think you have to look at something a bit more open, like you might see in Germany or in Holland, where people don't feel the need to constantly be watching over each other's shoulders, yet they still are able to run a decent society.
The U.S. devised a very sophisticated technique of surveillance, domination, control, subversion, undermining of nationalist movements, spreading rumors, violence if necessary. They established a Philippine constabulary, paramilitary force if you needed the violence. But a lot of it was just surveillance, control, subversion. Very sophisticated, very careful. They reached out all through the countryside, still in existence. It's one of the reasons why the Philippines is the only part of Asia that hasn't taken part in the high economic growth of the last couple of decades. Still a torture surveillance state. And these techniques were immediately came back to the United States itself and to other industrial countries. So during the Second World War, pretty much the same techniques were applied at home. And it continues. There's an interaction between torture, surveillance, control, domination abroad and applying the similar techniques at home.
I think the parallel between what's happening now in our developed countries with all these technologies that invade our liberties is just one time in the past when in Europe the church was at its strongest. It seems a very unfortunate comparison, but it's the only true comparison. The total control or the effort to have a total control over what people think and do in the late medieval period, just before the Renaissance, when the church had an orthodoxy. If people disagreed with the orthodoxy, they could be punished, even killed, if they were regarded as heretics, where everybody must believe the same thing and behave the same way and go to church on Sundays. And this was something that was strictly controlled and enforced, and it was enforced by surveillance as well. The surveillance of the community, watching other members of the community, of the priesthood, of the confessional in the church. By these means, a kind of totalitarianism was exercised over people. And it was more total than even the totalitarianisms of Nazism and Stalinism, because it also tried, in a way that, for example, Stalinism did, but not very successfully, to control what people thought and believed. Because if you can make small children believe that they are watched all the time by the invisible policeman, then it influences everything they do, even what they think, even if they don't speak, even if they don't do anything. That degree of surveillance, that degree of control over people was, of course, the dream of the church. That's what they would like to have been able to do 100%. And it is the only time in history which is like our present time. Our present time now is nearly, in one respect, like the Inquisition of Torquemada, where everybody is under a kind of maximum surveillance. And the ideal for the security services would be not only to know what people are doing, what they're saying, where they're going, where they went on a certain date at a certain time, but also what they're thinking.
The idea of the eye of God that's constantly watching you, and therefore, you behave better as a moral citizen because you know that God is watching what you do and you cannot escape the eye of God. And in some ways, CCTV today has replaced the eye of God. In a kind of post-religious society, CCTV is the new eye of God. It's the watching force that stops you from misbehaving, in theory.
Also, they told everybody that there is a policeman, a universal, invisible policeman, who knows everything. He even hears your thoughts. And what you do by yourself in the dark, he can see it. So this was the ideal of total surveillance that the church was able to persuade people actually happened. And it controlled their behavior as a result. But with the diminishing of the strength of religious beliefs of that kind, and with bigger houses and more wealth, more and more people, as time went by, were able to achieve quite a large degree of privacy. And I would say maybe around about the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, most people in most more advanced societies were able to achieve the kind of privacy or levels of privacy which we now can only dream about. But as technology has advanced, as the security situation has deteriorated, as countries have become bigger and more complex and more need for bureaucratic efficiency, so privacy has diminished again, and in the last 10 years, 20 years, very, very rapidly. Now we don't have it. I'll give you an example. There are specially trained people who watch CCTV monitors. They look at the behavior of people and they think that from that behavior they can tell that the person is thinking something bad, is going to do something in 5 minutes' time. So they can go and stop this person before that person does something bad. This is an attempt to try to penetrate even the thoughts and intentions and desires of people.
I mean, America is the greatest democracy on earth, for some. But for others, it's a very scary place after September 11th. Thousands of people were rounded up. We don't know their names. They didn't know the charges against them. Many were deported. And there were many people who were detained. And the squelching of dissent by surveillance has a very powerful effect. People are afraid, especially immigrants, are concerned because they're afraid of what could happen.
I was walking around Amsterdam and came on a bridge named Gerard van Janderveen. And it turned out that the bridge was named after the leader of a Dutch resistance raid on the Amsterdam Population Registry Office in 1942. Why did they raid the Population Registry Office? Because the Amsterdam Population Registry was a registry of the entire population with a description of every individual, including the religion. And it was being used by the Nazis to round up people and send them off to concentration camps. The raid was not entirely successful, partly because packed paper files can be very resistant to destruction by fire. Also, the leader of the raid was killed. So that's what the plaque commemorates. That's what the bridge is named after. And I recently learned that many towns in Amsterdam have a street named after him as one of the resistance heroes.
I always go back to World War II, to the White Rose Collective. It was a brother and sister in Germany named Hans and Sophie Scholl. They weren't Jewish, they were German Christians. And when the Nazis were at their height in power, Hans and Sophie thought, what can we do? And they thought, well, the best we can do is get information out so that the Germans will never be able to say we didn't know. And so they produced with their professor a series of pamphlets about what was happening, and they distributed them everywhere. I think of that like the media today. And on the fourth pamphlet was written across the top, "We will not be silent." Well, Hans and Sophie and their professor, they were captured by the Nazis. They were tried and they were convicted and they were beheaded. But that philosophy, that motto, should be the Hippocratic oath of the media today. We will not be silent.
Well, the democratic regimes which fought against the totalitarian regimes had many complaints against them, of course, but one of them was that living in a police state meant that you were under constant surveillance and people eavesdropping and breaking into your flat when you were at work and looking at your private documents and so on. So they complained about the lack of privacy, the totalitarian surveillance, the fact that everybody in the society was regimented, given very little margin of individuality and of privacy. Now the same democratic states are doing the same thing, but more comprehensively, more successfully, because they have better tools to do it than the totalitarian states ever did.
They are certainly getting a lot of material. They are certainly getting a lot of attention. And even though it might not work ultimately in making us safer, it does work insofar as making us less private. And think of it, when a cop can drive down the street at 30 or 40 miles an hour and scan every single license plate of every car he passes that's parked and see who has outstanding parking tickets, who's late paying alimony, who's wanted for some kind of crime, when he can do all of that in 30 seconds, what law enforcement agency, what government would not want that kind of power?
People who are consumers of intelligence obtained by surveillance presumably think they profit from it, or they wouldn't pay the costs of doing it. So, if you're talking about surveillance in that faintly sinister sense in which the word is usually used, then there's a disagreement about who is getting a benefit out of it. Right? The law enforcement people, will surely, once they get used to having a surveillance tool, they don't think they can do their jobs without it.
Governments and police forces like things to be easy. They like it to be predictable. They like to know where everything is. Now, if you ask any police force what would be their ideal world, they would of course say a police state. The description they would give you would be a police state. And it's not because they're inherently fascist or anything like that. It's because they know how to run that. It would make sense to them. If they knew where everyone was all the time, they knew who everyone was phoning and who they were talking to and who they were emailing and so on, they would think, okay, that's fine. Now we know we can do our job properly in that situation.
Governments have unlimited funding, and they have no trouble wasting money, playing around with technologies that might in the end not work at all. But they are certainly getting a lot of material. They are certainly getting a lot of attention. So does that make us safer? No, not necessarily. But it certainly makes us less private. And those are the kinds of things that are really hard to stop. But try taking a picture of a cop. Try turning the camera lens onto them, and you'll see a very different reaction. You're violating their privacy. But I think we need to do that more and more.
I think privacy is good, but we get used to it, I think. We get used to being looked at. I have to go.
Have you got identification with you? Have you all got identification?
What exactly are you doing? What are you filming?
We just got a call from the guys in the security, just because there's obviously big buildings here that are security buildings, and they worry about student filming.
Today, the police function largely via their own social organization. They have a system of what's called command and control. Policemen do walk beats, but they can call for support. People can come in cars. They have elaborate record keeping. Well, in one sense, that organization benefits. It thinks it can do its job better, right? It would claim the population benefits, right? Some people in the population probably agree, others probably disagree.
In the West, in Europe, in North America, perhaps the sense of surveillance somehow feels more tolerable. You only need to go to a Columbia, to a Zimbabwe, to a China or a Vietnam, and see what surveillance in the hands of draconian regimes can mean for people. It can lead to extrajudicial executions, to murder. It can lead to arbitrary detention. It can justify unfair trial. People can find themselves languishing in prison without appeal for years and years. And even our own so-called liberal democracies through this decade have chosen, through surveillance and violation of the right to privacy, to pick people up off the streets, send them to places like Guantanamo Bay, where without recourse to ordinary courts, people have languished illegally, unlawfully. The consequences of citizen complacency in the face of surveillance society can be grave.
As society becomes more accustomed to existing forms of surveillance, new forms become more acceptable. They seem less further away. And in fact, it's very difficult when you're inside a society which is going down the route of greater surveillance to say when a line has been crossed, because it always seems like the next reasonable step. Every step seems reasonable because you've already got some surveillance before. You get used to it. You know how it works. You're led to believe it's effective. And slowly, these processes of expansion, of intensification of surveillance occur without necessarily you even realizing that's going on. So it's very difficult, first of all, to practically tell in any society where the line is drawn. And in fact, as we know from history, you can be in a fairly democratic society one day and in a fascist state the next day, and you don't necessarily know precisely when that occurred. The line is wherever you haven't been yet. And the line is a choice. The line is a political choice. It's a question of politics. It's where we want it to be. So if you want to make a decision about how to fight surveillance, how to counter surveillance, we have to decide where that line is drawn.
Really, the best way of counter-surveillance, of preventing yourself from being watched, is to know where the cameras are, to spread that information around, and to avoid them or to confuse them.
One thing that technology, and especially computers, have changed is that it now doesn't require an army or a government to do something significant online. One individual or a small group of people can bring about enormous change, whether that is something positive and that would provide some social benefit. Like right now in Iran, there are a lot of hacktivists and hackers and technical people who are working with democracy activists and human rights advocates there. And this is on a fairly small scale compared to the might and power of governments and large military organizations, but small groups of people can make a tremendous change, and it doesn't take a lot of people.
Militaries are somewhat behind of the actual developments. What we see today are simple people from the streets, as it were, commencing attacks against nation states, against much larger entities that in conventional military terms wouldn't be inaccessible to them. So internet and cyber attacks have sort of empowered the people. The question is, how far will this go and how will it develop?
We could start by blowing up television transmitters. That might be a good beginning. If you know anyone who's doing that, I'd be happy to send them some cash. I think the first thing that you have to do is to somehow get rid of the monolithic thinking that media produce. And again, it's that question of propaganda, of everybody thinking about the same things all the time, because the newspapers and the TV has made certain subjects seem very important, and other ones seem not even to exist.
the cooperation on the attacker side is much more fluid, much better than it is on the government side, because governments, especially democracies, are sometimes hampered by the bureaucracy that holds them up.
If you do decide to do something that rocks the boat, well, you can cause all kinds of things to change. And I think the real danger is if people realize that. The real danger to the status quo is if a lot of people realize that, then the status quo's got quite a problem on their hands.
I think for activists, the main issue now is taking control of the agenda instead of letting governments control the agenda. What I mean by an agenda is the category of things that we think it's worth caring about and worth talking about. Now, if we allow governments to do that for us, if we allow them to set the agenda, we'll talk about and care about the things they want us to talk and care about. That's very dangerous. That means they can control our responses.
One of the most troubling things about our contemporary world is what George Orwell would call doublespeak. On the one hand, governments talk about liberty and democracy and freedom, and they even start wars to protect democracy. But on the other hand, they license this tremendous invasion of privacy and this diminution of civil liberties in the name of security. So we're going to protect democracy by taking away democracy. We're going to make you protect your freedom by making you less free. We're going to secure your civil liberties as a member of a liberal democracy by diminishing the actual degree of your civil liberties. And there is a kind of hypocrisy, a deep paradox in our contemporary societies. The political rhetoric on the one hand and the actuality on the other hand are two very different things.
That's perfectly normal. I mean, why should any system of power and domination let people know what it's doing? Of course, they want to keep their practices secret, and they're helped in this by the media, by the intellectual classes who don't bring the information out or don't at least but don't place it in the proper context. Control and use of language is a major technique of propaganda, of influence, of shaping perceptions, and so on. In fact, there are master rhetoricians who do this. One of them just won the Nobel Prize for Peace the other day.
Propaganda is very serious, and we have to sniff it out. We have to find when we are being propagandized, because so often it is used to justify a government policy that is highly problematic. For example, you look at the lead up to the invasion of Iraq in 2003. The story, the mythology, the lie of weapons of mass destruction, repeated over and over again by the Bush administration. But if President Bush just had a megaphone on the steps of the White House, he might have convinced a few people. But he had something much more powerful. He had the U.S. media, more powerful than any bomb, more powerful than any missile. And the Pentagon's deployed the media, and we have to take it back.
Some governments have been saying in recent years that the first duty of government is to keep the people safe. And that's false. The first duty of government is to keep the people free. And that means saying to people, to be free is risky. You can't be kept safe if you're free, but you must accept it because you are an adult, you're a grown-up, and you should understand that.
If the surveillance system is perfect, that is, the state has a system of surveillance by which it can monitor everything that everybody does all the time. And if this is done so efficiently that the data subjects are not aware of being subject to surveillance, what's wrong with it? It gives more power than a bad man should have or a good man should want. That to give that kind of power to anyone or anybody in position of authority would be simply too tempting for it to be misused.
You know, if you put rats under surveillance, they become neurotic. Put a rat under surveillance. Keep watching a rat. Many animals, if you keep watching them, they'll become agitated. They'll cease to function normally. The same applies to human beings. We will simply stop people from behaving normally. We'll re-engineer the way people behave. We'll re-engineer the way they treat their relationships, not just between themselves as people, but with their government, with the institutions around them. That's not the world I want to live in. I want a world where we're free.
We live in a surveillance society that has to be closely watched.
If everybody begins to realize how much they're watched all the time, it makes them change the way they behave, where they go, what they do, and who they interact with. So the very fabric of society can be adversely affected by the way that society monitors itself.
Every country has been affected in the climate of the war on terror. We've seen it in tolerance for unfair trial. We've seen it in extension of the period of time in which people can be detained arbitrarily, which is the ultimate invasion of privacy in terms of your bodily, your territorial right to privacy, to be forcibly detained in a way that you cannot access your workplace, your family, your home.
And the tragedy of history is that this brief moment in which human beings in some parts of the world could be free to the extent possible in the network of society and relationships, that this moment of freedom has already been diminished because of all these fears about security.
What we've learned over the years, in fact over the centuries, is that if you want freedom and you want justice, you're going to have to fight for it. There are systems of concentrated power that don't want you to have it for good reasons. and they will try as much as they can to prevent the exercise of freedom or even formal rights. So if you want them, you're going to have to work.
As the great abolitionist Frederick Douglass, who had been a slave and then spoke out against it, had a newspaper, the North Star, which published the stories of slaves and the problems with slavery. As he said, power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has and it never will. People have to be able to feel safe and free to make those demands.
We should make a lot of effort and put a lot of energy into trying to protect civil liberties as far as possible. Because if we don't, they will go. If you don't fight, you lose. And it's in the nature of what governments want to do and think is their duty that our civil liberties and our privacy will be further and further and further eroded.
Human rights aren't a luxury. Human rights got formed and articulated out of horror, out of, the state betraying the citizen in the most ultimate fashion. Human rights are not a luxury. They're essential to sustainable society.
A lot of freedom has been won over the years. I mean, Argentina isn't what it was under the dictatorship, and the United States isn't what it once was either. So a lot of people have won a lot of freedom through popular struggle, and those impose limits on the capacity of systems of power to coerce and to control. But the struggle never ends, and it never will as long as there is hierarchy, domination, concentration of power, and so on. Over time, there are improvements, and if people dedicate themselves to it, they can construct a more free and just society. But it's not going to happen by itself, and there will always be counterforces.
we recognize that the loss of privacy has already happened, but that doesn't mean that we can't get it back, that we can't fight for it, that we can't try to reverse what's happened. And we can use these wonderful ideas in the Declaration of Human Rights as part of the effort to get some privacy back.
I don't understand why people don't get angry. I just don't understand why there aren't people marching in their tens of thousands on the streets. When government proposed 42-day rule on detention, there was a lot of anger because people could imagine the individual who has been treated this way. But when government does something to an entire population, when it takes privacy from millions of people, then suddenly there's inactivity. People care, obviously, people do care, but it's only when it comes down to the individual who has been destroyed by the state that you see people marching in the streets.
Your most closely kept personal thought, put it in the word doc with the password lock. Sock it deep in the raw with extraction precluded by the ludicrous length and the strength of a reputedly dictionary attack proof string of characters. This imperative to thwart all the disparages of privacy, the NSA and homeliness. You better PGP the raw because so far they ain't impressed. You better take the PGP and print the hex of it out. Scan that into a TIFF, then if you secret out for your data, scramble up the order of the pixels with a one-time pad that describes the fun time had by the thick soul boot-wearing stomper who danced to produce random claptrap. All the intervals in between which set in tandem with the stomps themselves begat a seed of math unguessable. Ain't no complaint about the cipher that's redressable. Best of all your secret, nothing extant could extract it. By 2025, a children speaking spell could crack it. You can't hide secrets from the future with math. You can try, but I bet that in the future they laugh at the half-fast schemes and algorithms of mass to enforce cryptographs in the past. You can't hide secrets from the future with math. You can try, but I bet that in the future they laugh at the half-fast schemes and algorithms of mass to enforce cryptographs in the past. In future, people do not give a damn about your shopping. Your Visa number SSL to cherry popping hot grandpa action websites that you visit, nor password protected partitions, no matter how illicit. And this, it would seem, is your saving grace. The amazing haste of people to forget your name, your face. You're lit in this list of indefensible indiscretions. In fact, the only way that you could pray to make impression on the era ahead is if instead of being notable, you make the data describing you undecodable. The script kiddies sifting in that relic called the internet, seeking latches on treasure chests that they could wreck in seconds, but didn't yet get a chance to queue up for this assembly to discover and crack the cover like a creme brulee. They'll glance you over, I guess, and then for a bare moment you'll persist to exist. Almost seem like you're there, don't it? But you're not, you're here. Your name will fade as fronts will. That's in the future, they don't know our crypto variable still. You can't hide secrets from the future with math. You can try, but